I'm going to deal with one of the hot topics in the debates on governance and development in Africa. It's focused on aid, and I think before I start, I should perhaps give a little bit of background so that you understand that I'm not just making up what I'm going to say. For 4 years, I was equivalent, actually civil servant in the Ministry of Planning and Finance in Mozambique between 1999 and 2003. That was an interesting time. There was the HIPIC period, the first PRSPs. In fact, our government in Mozambique was one of the first to produce a PRSP, which was approved by the Bretton Woods institutions. So it was quite a momentous period in terms of the relationships between African governments and aid agencies, generally, bilateral and multilateral agencies. And I did learn a lot. So in a way, it was a kind of participant observation where I built a number of ideas on how government-donor relations work and some of the problems, the key problems that arise in the sustained engagement between African governments, in general, recipient country governments, and aid agencies and the aid complex, what we call the aid complex. Then more recently, I have done some primary research in Senegal at the Ministry of Planning, Ministry of Finance and the Economy, essentially with civil servants, medium, high level, working on policy documents and actual economic strategies for the country, and with very strong direct links with the biggest and most influential those in the country. So I did some qualitative and quantitative research among a significant sample of civil servants there in order to learn partly some of the same issues that I had experienced in Mozambique, and also to look at the employment and career histories of many of the people working in the Ministry of Finance in Senegal. So a number of themes have emerged out of this experience and research. I'm going to try to raise some of these. I can't cover everything that relates to, especially broadly, aid effectiveness debates. These are quite big. I will say something about them. So I'm essentially going to focus on some of the key issues in the aid governance nexus, some of the key problems that a lot of states are facing, partly because of aid, but not only because of aid. And I say something also about an old theme, which is conditionality in policy space and where the trends are going at the moment. So, as I say, some of the issues I'm going to try to cover relate to aid effectiveness debates and some of the key hypotheses and theses about why aid hasn't been as effective as expected, and there's a lot of literature on this, very much dominated by mainstream neoclassical economists, and I will say something about that. And then some background empirical information that I think it's important in order to understand the context. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about aid and state, what I call state capacity debuilding. I haven't seen this term used by anyone else, so I think I can coin the pattern. And there's a sort of ironic twist on this idea of capacity building, which is so central to much of the engagement of aid agencies in developing countries, especially relatively aid-dependent states. And I'll say something about why I talk about aid capacity or state capacity debuilding. And something about conditionality, policy space, and ideology. And then I'll mention a few things about some of the contradictions that have emerged in relationship with the governance agenda and aid relations. So broadly speaking, if you look at the issues, the literature that are relevant to these questions, I think it's important to understand aid in processes of state formation. I think the presentation yesterday was extremely interesting. It wasn't very much focused on aid, but South Sudan in a way is a very interesting case in terms of how aid has played a role in processes of state formation. And indeed, if you want to understand state formation in many places in Africa, you need to understand aid relations and the political settlements, how they relate to the aid establishment or to the aid complex. Aid as a factor affecting the nature of states and practices. So there's a lot of literature in the political sciences about the nature of the African state or the state in developing countries, whether it's rentier, neo-patrimonial, or developmental. So some of the questions around the impact of aid have significant link with the nature, how political scientists, for example, describe the nature of states, in particular in African policies. A third key theme in much of the literature is around accountability and legitimacy. So it relates to how the aid complex and their relations affect state-society relations, okay? And the question of to what extent states are more or less accountable to their own societies vis-a-vis donors. And this is a sort of very common theme, something that a lot of people have raised in aid effectiveness debates. Conditionality and policy space, I will say quite a bit about that, and aid and state capacity building. So in terms of the background and the context, what we call the aid complex or the aid industry, whatever term you want to refer to, is one that has been growing almost without interruption in terms of its institutional setup, in terms of the number of organizations and institutions involved, countries as donors and as recipients, despite some shifting trends in terms of the overall volume of aid. So this systematic increase is associated with this growing complexity in aid delivery systems and institutional setups. For example, the number of NGOs has been mushrooming over the last 40 years worldwide, and indeed those operating in African context, and nobody really knows how many. I mean, maybe Mike knows better, but there are some estimates that put the number around 30, 40, 50,000. And I'm talking just about international NGOs, not national, local NGOs working in development. Recipient countries also have expanded, and increasingly you have a situation, an ironic situation of countries which are both donors and recipients, adding complexity to the analysis. In a sample of 14 countries which were characterized by significant levels of aid dependence in terms of the macroeconomic indicators as proportion of GDP or proportion of government expenditures, there were 35,000 in a study that was cited by Roger Riddell. 35,000 annual official aid transactions were recorded, which amounted to around 200 per country. This is an average. It means that a number of countries registered more than 300-400 official transactions related to aid programs, projects, whatever, in a given year. Okay, so you can imagine now the overall significance and the size of this complex. In broad macro terms, if you look at the evolution, one can indeed identify some key stages. This is overall aid that goes to least developed countries, to the poorest countries in terms of overall volume, okay, in constant dollar terms, and in proportion of total aid. And as you can see here, there's three basic stages that are important to understand. The Cold War structural adjustment program period, which saw a massive expansion of the aid complex, both in terms of volume, but also in terms of institutions involved. During the 1990s, and to a large extent because of the end of Cold War, there is a decline in real terms that goes to least developed countries in total volume, constant terms. But then from late 90s onwards, massive surge that has continued until now, okay? Both in terms of bilateral and multilateral aid. That is associated with a number of issues. One, of course, is the debt relief initiatives, which have been accounted for in terms of numbers as fresh aid, and one could say something about that, but I don't have the time. And then obviously the war on terror that has had an impact, massive impact on aid allocations to a number of least developed countries, and that obviously includes countries like Afghanistan, which has received a large share of this surge in the last 10 years or so. If we look at, from the point of view of the recipient, to understand the significance and relative importance of aid, one can clearly see that for Sub-Saharan Africa, low-income countries, that's a majority of countries in the region according to the classifications, aid remains the most important source of foreign finance. Okay, so from a macroeconomic point of view, you have to understand aid as a source of foreign finance, of foreign savings, which is in principle theoretically designed to fill a number of gaps. It's designed to fill a savings gap, because there are significant savings gaps in poor developing countries, foreign exchange gaps foreign exchange constraints, which are partly eased by the availability of aid, but also fiscal gaps, the extent to which government expenditures can be boosted through access to aid. And despite all the talk about the importance of foreign direct investment or private investment as a source of foreign savings and foreign finance, still for a large number of African countries, the only and most realistic source of finance remains aid. Only a few middle-income countries are characterized by a slightly more dependence on other flows. And indeed, that contrasts with other developing countries, where integration in financial markets, capacity to attract foreign direct investment is far larger, more developed than in most of sub-Saharan Africa. And despite the increases in FDI to many African countries because of the commodity boom in the 2000s, this hasn't changed dramatically. So aid remains an inescapable source of foreign finance. So for those like Dambisa Moyo who say that aid should be abolished, this is actually an irresponsible proposition. Okay? The interesting thing is that if we start disaggregating by countries, then we see a very heterogeneous image in which countries which, from the point of view of needs, the level of income per capita and so on, should attract similar levels of aid in terms of, in per capita terms, attract very different levels, okay? Both, if you look at it today or more recently, and also in terms of evolution. So some countries have done much better than others. So clear contrast can be established between a country like Mozambique that has done really well in terms of attracting aid after the during the post-war period, after the mid-1990s, compared to Niger, a country that is still very highly dependent on aid and very much in need of more official aid. And the contrast between Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, which still remains, in absolute terms, a big recipient of aid from official donors. So, having seen this background, let's start talking about the key question, that many people have tried to address, the issue of aid effectiveness and some of the pessimism that has emerged from the literature about the extent to which aid doesn't work or is counterproductive or doesn't work as well as it should. And here the bad news is that actually we don't know. If you believe the methods and the analysis done especially by mainstream macroeconomic economists, macroeconomic analysts, you have a plethora of conclusions and findings. You have different methodologies, different time periods in the analysis, different policy indicators used to understand the impact of aid on growth, different outcomes as well. Okay? So this is essentially the work that has been done in order to understand what the impact is between aid flows overall, from a macro perspective, and economic growth. Well, that's the sort of key development outcome that has been analyzed in this literature. And the economists simply don't agree. Partly because I would say, I can't get into the details, but the methodologies used are absolute rubbish from a statistical point of view itself. So there is a lot of spurious correlations going on in much of these analyses. Notably, trying to do cross-country regression analysis, as many of these economists do, and use very dodgy policy indicators is a non-starter. And I'm just talking in terms of a statistician point of view, not my own political economy point of view, okay? So statistically, many of these results do not tell us much. They are pretty much inconsistent, and the explanatory variables are not very well defined. So it's not a very useful sort of source of information, if you want. But this kind of literature has, driven a whole debate about the various reasons why aid hasn't been effective, okay, or hasn't been as effective as expected. And in that sense, some of these spillover debates have been interesting to an extent, or have raised a number of interesting issues. And there are many different types of theses around the idea of ineffective aid. One is the destination bias, i.e. some people arguing that a basic reason why this doesn't work is because aid doesn't go to the countries that need it most. It goes to many middle-income countries, it goes for uses which are not supposed to be the most developmental-oriented, so on and so forth. So there's a kind of destination bias going on, which is very strongly associated with something that everyone should know if you know a little bit of the political economy of aid, which is the central importance of geopolitics in understanding aid allocations and where aid goes and why. Okay? The second type of argument, very much associated with the work of macroeconomists, relates to the perverse macroeconomic effects that aid may have, especially on low-income economies with severe gaps, savings, fiscal and foreign exchange gaps, and significant vulnerability to external fluctuations and so on. And I'll say something about that in a minute. Then, perhaps the most influential of the perspectives by people like Paul Collier, among others, is the policy environment. And that is more centrally to what we're talking about in this course. So bad governance being in itself an explanatory factor that allows us to make sense of this ineffectiveness. And here, there is no consensus as to what the direction of causality is, whether bad governance affects aid and the effectiveness of aid, but it's actually aid itself that drives deterioration of governance. Okay? And there are different ideas and arguments about this perspective. And then more broadly, one could also think of broadly institutional outcomes and relations or impact of aid on how states develop and how states change, are reformed and so on. I think that's also quite central, especially since the 1990s with the rise of the good governance agenda, where the reform of the state has been quite central to aid relations, the good governance agenda and aid. So that relates to partly the issue of state capacity building that I mentioned before. Okay, now let me just say something about these macroeconomic issues before we move on to the institutional part, because I think they are important to understand some of the variable outcomes across countries. And here you have three basic ideas. One is Dutch disease. I'm not going to go into details here, but basically suggests that a problem with aid is similar to problems related to any windfall gain from, for example, commodity booms, huge surge in foreign exchange earnings that have an impact on the exchange rate. So if you have a system with floating exchange rates, that creates an imbalance. Exchange rate, the domestic currency tends to appreciate. That can also have an impact on domestic inflation, so on and so forth. That affects negatively the competitiveness of the economy through the exchange rate mechanism. So there's a sort of perverse effect. On the one hand, you're getting a lot of foreign exchange. On the other hand, you are eroding your export capacities through exchange rates. This is what Dutch disease referred to, which is related to a story in the Netherlands about the finds of gas supplies and the impact that this had on the exchange rate in the Netherlands. The evidence so far, the macroeconomic evidence, tends to suggest that actually there's no conclusion, there's no real robust evidence to show that there's a Dutch disease problem going on in Africa. And that affects both, that relates both aid flows, but also for many countries that receive significant foreign exchange from minerals, including oil exporters. So the few examples of Dutch disease that have been recorded mostly relate to oil revenues, and no example of Dutch disease associated with aid. So one can discard that. Second problem that some have raised is the crowding out of domestic savings. This sort of disincentive that is created through aid dependence in terms of not mobilizing enough resources in order to increase domestic national savings. Okay, so you get into a sort of vicious circle of aid dependence, domestic savings remain very low, and then you keep deepening the dependence on aid flows as a source of foreign savings. Okay, here again, the macroeconomic evidence is pretty much inconclusive. You can't really establish a clear pattern, a clear relationship between these two. And the variation in domestic rates, savings rates in Africa is such that this relationship cannot be concluded. Thirdly, this is perhaps much more important, especially for many African countries that received significant amounts of loans, concessional loans in the 1980s through structural adjustment and so on, was the debt aid spiral. The extent to which there was a correlation between increases in aid flows, particularly through multilateral agencies and through concessional loans, and subsequent debt crises, which eventually led to the debt relief initiatives that ended with the HIPIC initiative in 1999. And here the evidence is much more robust, much more consistent. Indeed, there seems to be a clear correlation between what happened in the 1980s and the levels of debt and the debt burden that affected a large number of economies in sub-Saharan Africa in the 1990s onwards, and which had a very significant impact, obviously, in fiscal balances and fiscal policy. But there is actually, in my view, one way more significant perverse macroeconomic effect of aid. And this is related to volatility. If there's something that characterizes, from a macroeconomic perspective, aid flows as a source of foreign finance, is its unreliability. The unreliability across countries, but within countries, obviously. You know, the extent to which there are fluctuations that have an impact, obviously, on the resource envelope that states face in the medium to long term. Some studies have shown that volatility of aid is actually even higher than the volatility of export revenues. And you know, we know that for many countries in the region, volatility of export revenues, because of lack of diversification and the nature of commodity exports, is quite high already. So that gives you a sense of the problem. But also, in addition to this, is the perverse pro-cyclical pattern of many of these fluctuations, i.e. aid goes, you know, when things go well, more aid comes in. When things go badly, less aid comes into the country. So that sort of reinforces some of these cycles from a macroeconomic perspective. I think the most important implication of this, I'll come back to this later on, especially for policymakers, and that's a number of people in this room who work in government, is the impact that this has on your macroeconomic and fiscal projections. Not surprisingly, it's not just because of IMF preferences, and that's very much related to the nature of aid, but a lot of countries in this region have to conform to medium-term expenditure frameworks that have a 3-year horizon. Part of the reasons, that, you know, maybe not everyone says this, but part of the reason has to do with the actual unpredictability of aid flows. Countries that depend, or states that depend on aid or for, let's say, 50 to 80% of the public investments, which is the case in countries like Mozambique, 40, 60% of total government expenditures. Predicting these flows is absolutely central for your medium-term or long-term planning, okay? Medium-term expenditure frameworks may be useful to deal with short-term macroeconomic dynamics in the economy. They are problematic if you want to engage in long-term investment plans, for example, infrastructure and so on, in which case then you have to rely on project type of aid that is directly linked to specific project, but which is not integrated in a broad macroeconomic fiscal framework. I don't know if you get the point, okay? So what this is having, aid volatility in itself has had a massive impact on eroded capacities among many African states to actually be able to plan in the long term and to a gradual but systematic orientation towards short-term issues, okay, dealing with the short term, at best with the medium term, 4 to 5 years at best. That reflects, to a large extent, the instability, the inherent instability of donor-recipient country relations, which has to do with political issues most of the time. This graph illustrates this point, and what is interesting about this graph is that the coefficient of variation of aid flows is quite high regardless of your level of attraction of aid in annual terms. So you have countries that attract significant, if you take the 1965 to 2007, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Kenya being, you know, big recipients of aid, they face similar levels of volatility compared to countries that receive very little amounts of aid, you know, relatively speaking. And that's paradoxical in the sense that you would expect to see a sort of more consistent pattern here, you know, less variation among the big recipients and more variation among the small recipients. South Africa, of course, yeah. And I think was one of the last donor charts for the United States, South Africa was number 10 recipient for United States. in 2010. Yeah, there's a lot of, if you go to the OECD website, all this information is available online. You look for donor charts, where the aid is going. I have, I could have shown some here. You would find lots of surprises, or what the top recipients are for certain countries, especially for United States or Japan, and some bilateral donors that have very particular geopolitical and business-related reasons to give aid. Now, let me then go to the question of capacity building and some of the problematics that arise in this regard. And that's very much related to the point that I made before on the aid volatility and its perverse impact on how policymakers can actually work. There's another issue, which is the extent to which states have experienced a loss in capacity, in certain governance capacities, which have to do with the possibility of designing and implementing coherent long-term development strategies. Okay? So the hypothesis here is that a lot of states in the region have lost capacities to develop this kind of strategic thinking. Okay? And part of the hypothesis is that this is partly in some cases and in other cases largely related to the perversity of some of these aid relations. Okay? And this is despite the fact that capacity building is quite a central keyword in much of the aid complex. A lot of aid agencies give money for capacity building and so on. The question is what sorts of capacities are being created. Part of the capacity building discourse is related to an idea which was quite prominent, especially in the 1990s, that African states had inadequate capacities. Part of this idea had to do with the argument that you should not expect African states to develop, for example, broad, coherent, and ambitious development strategies for the long term because these capacities are not there. So you have to reduce quite a lot the scope and degree of state intervention. So part of the argument in the 90s was around this question of state capacities. And as John Sander put it in 2002, this was a little bit a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, which had to do with the engagement during the 1980s and 1990s, very much influenced by structural adjustment programs and the effect that this had on capacities to develop long-term strategies. But let me go to the micro level and give a few examples of how the aid complex has contributed to this significant and gradual erosion of these capacities. This is what I call state capacity debuilding. And I'm sure that many of you obviously know about these processes and mechanisms. First of all is the distortions that aid relations and engagement with aid agencies, projects, programs, and so on, has on government pay structures. Okay? I'm thinking here of the various mechanisms that aid agencies have traditionally used to bypass existing structures and, for example, pay rules. So the emergence of per diems, the culture of per diem, top-ups, salary top-ups, secondments, and so on, becoming increasingly part of the working mechanisms of aid agencies in developing countries generally, and especially African countries. The problem with this, obviously, these are designed to give incentives so that civil servants and people working in administration participate more actively in the design, elaboration, implementation of projects. But one of the indirect effects is that this creates essentially serious perverse fragmentation within bureaucracies, where you basically face the emergence of different classes of civil servants. Those who are linked to aid agencies or to the aid business more directly, for example, through secondment and so on. Those who are linked indirectly and on ad hoc basis through workshops, per diems, etc. Those who are excluded. Okay? This fragmentation has serious impact in terms of morale and interactions within the bureaucracy. So there is a lot going on, and I witnessed this clearly in Mozambique, in my experience, of, in a sense, silent boycotting of what some departments do or some civil servants do in order to achieve certain goals, including promotions and so on. The second significant perverse effect is the distortions that this brings about in terms of the budgeting system. in many countries that have received significant amounts of aid, especially 1990s onwards, there has been a serious loss of control of the budget process, i.e., when you see the budget, especially in the 1990s, this has been partly reversed since the Paris Declaration, but only partly. What was published in the central budget had very little to do with the actual final expenditures. So in some cases, what we call in the jargon off budgets were a very high proportion of total government expenditure. That has an impact in terms of how central agencies within the state can actually plan and develop strategies for the long term if there's no sufficient information and control over what's happening at the sector level. Okay? So the central state, the Minister of Finance, is not really having a grip on how much money is being spent and how many activities and projects being implemented in the Ministry of Health, Education, and so on, and that creates serious problems in terms of managing fiscal expenditure, which then leads to situations where the IMF comes and say, well, look at these fiscal slippages, with reference to our initial commitments. And that has to do with how the aid complex works. The third point is related to the fragmentation, the growing fragmentation complexity of aid delivery systems, and how that leads to seriously inefficient time management. There were studies in the 90s which show that I can't remember exactly the number, but I think it was around 45 to 50 weeks for many top-level civil servants were devoted to meetings or work associated with the management of aid. That is disproportionate compared to how much actually aid contributes to the overall budget, for example. Okay? A lot of civil servants spending at least on average more than 50 to 75% of their time essentially in duplication of tasks and meetings which have very little impact on the day-to-day routine work, which also needs to be done. And indeed, when I was doing my research on Senegal, that was a quantitative number I was trying to come up with, and indeed for some of the higher level civil servants, the Ministry of Finance, the figures were around 60 to 80%. And there was a clear sense that much of it was a waste of time, or it was absolutely unnecessary. And that has led in some cases to reactions. Okay, so I think there's someone here from Tanzania. In Tanzania, there were some measures taken by the government to stop these, sort of nonsense, and of course there's some efforts to reduce this. But in fact, even nowadays, the extent to which this fragmentation has led to inefficient time management remains a serious issue. That obviously leads to serious loss of capacities to think and articulate long-term strategies. In order to prepare a 5-year plan, you actually need to start 2 years earlier, for example, and requires a lot of human resources, a lot of meetings itself. And if this is disconnected, for example, from the aid complex, then you have a serious problem because you will have to deal with both at the same time. Then there's a question of poaching or brain drain, whichever way you want to call it. Again, a growing problem. It wasn't as big in the 1980s, but from the 1990s onwards has clearly worsened. That is related to the actual, precisely sort of inadequate capacities that many donors were talking about in the 1990s, and to the perverse incentive structures that impact on the work of aid agencies. Interestingly, the increasing decentralization of operations among aid agencies has led to increasing needs for local recruitment. Okay? So that is putting a significant burden on the state. Why is that? Well, interestingly, because some of the targets, the recruitment targets, happen to be within the state. This is partly because it is in the state that you're going to find some of the more skilled personnel, the people who know more about how to do X, Y, and Z, which is important for your day-to-day aid operations. But also because aid agencies in their recruitment strategies, untold recruitment strategies, they do target key people within the administration who can exert a positive influence on future engagements in terms of project approval, in terms of connections with key figures within the political settlement, ministers, so on and so forth. So it's not only about the skills themselves or about how good they are, whether they have PhDs or not. There are not many PhDs in the country. It is also about connections. So it's not surprising that medium, high-level civil servants are very often directly targeted and poached, and they also have the better chances to get employment in these international organizations and bilateral agencies with country offices. So this leads to serious loss of institutional memory. okay? And it is an increasing problem. In the case of Senegal, I realized that a serious generational gap is going on, whereby you have an old generation of civil servants who have been working for the past 30, 40 years, some very close to retirement, who had sort of long-term career prospects within the administration. The new recruits, the sort of younger civil servants in their 20s and 30s, and especially those positions of high-level positions with much better salaries, by the way, so good material incentives, these civil servants do not go beyond the 5 years in the administration. The administration is just a stepping stone towards a better job. The career logic has significantly changed. Public employment is not longer attractive, okay? And the experience of many people actually getting access to these jobs has exerted a sort of pull effect. So look, I know X and Y, they were in my promotion, look, they're doing very well in UNDP. So this is actually something that seems to be quite serious, and although there are discussions among aid agencies that this is something that should be avoided, unfortunately the incentive structures within aid agencies goes in the opposite direction, towards actually poaching more and more. And finally, obviously, all this has an impact in some countries, especially those countries where these effects are more serious, in terms of the capacity that the states have to raise domestic resources, to mobilize domestic resources. Taxes, for example. Jonathan DeJohn will give a session on taxation, which is quite important. And these, in some cases, can lead to deepening aid dependence. This is less clear. It is true that in the last 10 years, there has been an improvement. More and more countries increasing the level of domestic fiscal revenues as a proportion of total GDP. So aid dependence has been partly attenuated. But this might be just a blip related to the commodity boom of the 2000s. If the commodity bonanza disappears, I'm not sure whether these levels of taxation will be maintained, because the time involved in managing domestic revenue is also quite important. Part of this problem, and these types of perverse mechanisms, has to do with changes within the aid system, changes which were supposed to improve aid delivery, which had a very clear rationale, but interestingly, the way they've been implemented has had some perverse effects. Let me just try to explain this briefly. First of all, aid flows to many African countries have traditionally been in the form of projects, individual projects, some of them very large, some of them very small. Actually, the average size has tended to decrease, so that also adds to the transaction cost burden of trying to manage these different projects. These project delivery mechanism remains pretty much alive in all countries. On top of this, you have program aid. Program aid of a sector nature, the famous sector-wide approach programs, which basically refer to the pooling of resources among different donors for a specific program or sector. Let's say that a number of donors get together, pool resources for the Ministry of Health. A number of donors pool resources for primary education and so on. And many countries have gone into this direction. All these mechanisms, by the way, come with their own management units, the program aid, program support. And then you have the latest version, which is general budget support. And of course, especially those sitting in the Ministry of Finance, this is the preferred mechanism. In the ideal world, you would have all your aid going through the central budget so that you can actually implement your long-term, medium-term development strategies in a more coherent way, okay? And there has been a significant push in this direction, and a lot of donors have bought into this, especially the EU, Netherlands, DFID to a large extent. They've tried to sort of increase the proportion of money that goes through budget support. What is interesting and perverse about this is actually, when you think about it, you say, well, that's good. Money goes to the central budget, and nobody's telling you where to spend it and so on. Budget support doesn't come for free. Budget support, in the experiences where this has been significant, Mozambique is one case where around 20% of aid now goes through budget support. It comes with its own institutional mechanisms, management units, and setups, special setups. This is more informal, actually. It is less formalized. But the donor budget support review groups are becoming a very significant phenomenon in many countries. And indeed, Mozambique is perhaps one of the best examples. So this group it starts as an informal group to oversee the implementation of priorities associated with general budget support, which is essentially the domestic policies. It starts with 5 donors. It started, I think, 5 or 6 donors when they started putting money into the central budget. And then it started to grow. Why? Because some bilateral donors realized that these particular groups were quite good at influencing key people within the administration, notably the ministers of finance. They say, well, this is a nice club to be able to actually exert some influence on what sorts of things, and especially trying to build networks of influence around key decision-making points within the administration, okay? Which has led, in the case of Mozambique, to the growth of these budget support groups from 6, 7 to 19. So they have 19 donors. So you have, the odd small donor like Belgium that goes, gives $100, let's say, has $1 million programs, but they want to sit on the table to actually hear what's going on, what sorts of discussions they have around budget support. On top of this, these review groups meet every 3 or 6 months, depending on the country, and they have almost never-ending lists of targets, which partly duplicate other targets associated with other frameworks of relations. So you can imagine the effect that this has on someone sitting in the Ministry of Finance, having to deal with the budget support group, having to deal with program aid in health, having to do with individual projects, so on, so forth. So if you look at Mozambique, what you have is an increase of general budget support, quite an interesting increase, but program aid, for example, stagnated, and individual projects, overall, went up, okay? So what you have is a coexistence of delivery mechanisms. The Paris Declaration had committed towards a sort of more appropriation, more ownership on the part of governments through mechanisms like budget support. This cannot happen if you have these different forms of aid delivery actually coexisting. So if you think about it, actually, adding budget support to the delivery system has added problems, okay? The only way this could work more seriously would be through an actual real replacement. Will this happen? The short answer is no. There will never be a scenario in which big donors will commit to give 100% of their resources to general budget support. So this scenario being unrealistic, then we have a serious problem in terms of how to deal with this from the point of view of the policymaker, how to deal with these different mechanisms. Now let me discuss the next point, which relates to conditionalities and policy space. Part of it is also related to the question of the fragmentation of the aid system. And in fact, both program aid, projects, budget support have always come, and indeed still come, with significant levels of conditionality and evolving conditionality frameworks. So conditionality has always, to a certain extent, been there. But what is the trend? The trend, interestingly, this is paradoxical, because even agencies like the IMF and the World Bank or DFID have committed to reduce the number of conditions associated with aid programs. This hasn't happened. What we have at the moment is an expansion on the number of conditions and the range of areas in which conditionality plays a significant role, okay? So that's what Danny Roderick calls Washington confusion. We have moved from the Washington consensus to the Washington confusion. The Washington consensus characterized by a very clear set of principles and rules and conditions, very much related to macroeconomic policies and so on, to a plethora of targets, conditions, and that go, range across the whole gamut of policies, from the justice sector to macroeconomic policies, sectorial policies, so on and so forth. So the space of conditionality has actually been expanded and deepened. The other important change that has happened is that there has been a significant move towards selectivity. So many governments can no longer get away with making promises and not implementing these promises. Okay? Now, more money is going to governments, administrations that have shown a certain record on a whole range of policies and institutional changes. And that obviously reduces the kind of negotiating capital policy space that governments have in terms of relations with donors. The third type of change relates to the type of conditionality and the way conditionality works. And this is perhaps more serious and relates to what I been talking about a moment ago. We're moving from outcomes to process. In the past, conditionality would be you can't exceed X% of your GDP for fiscal deficit, okay? Now we're moving into conditionalities that relate to how policies are elaborated. The PRSP is a very good example of that, of process conditionality. Things like you have to organize and implement a consultation process to discuss the education policy or your PRSP is a process conditionality that has major implications in terms of what sorts of things are discussed and who participates in this discussion. Increasingly, aid agencies have a significant role in intervening more directly into policy processes because of process conditionality. So again, in that sense, there has been a very significant deepening of conditionality framework, despite the fact the rhetoric by some aid agencies that this is being becoming more flexible. The IMF is not as rigid as it used to be, blah, blah. This is a discourse that is being generated in the last 5 years, especially after the global financial crisis. So the next question that you could ask is, how did this happen? Did this happen because the IMF was coming and telling the Minister of Finance, you have to do this and that? No. The processes are much more subtle than this, and there has been a significant gradual change in the way policymakers work, and the way the administrations, the civil servants work. So on the one hand, you have situations in which self-censorship is a significant phenomenon, and it has been entrenched, since the 1990s. Policymakers, people working in certain departments, know the score. They know what are the boundaries of the policy space. So there are certain things that are not worth negotiating. So you have to choose, what is your best battle. That reduces a number of policy options that, could be considered, because of the conditions, the circumstances of the country. Secondly, in the last 20 years or so, there has been a significant, what I would call cartelization of the donor community. Whereas in the past, many governments could sort of play with having different donors with different perspectives, with lack of coherence and so on. Well, now increasingly more and more donors are following very similar type of conditionality frameworks, and they are agreeing on a set of very concrete outcomes, whether it's good governance, macroeconomic policies, sector policies, poverty reduction, whatever that's the case. That obviously increases the bargaining power from the donor side, reduces partly the bargaining power from the recipient side. But thirdly, and I think this is less understood, less researched, is more controversial, there has been indeed a gradual ideological conversion of a significant emergent technocratic class that is essentially thinking like many aid agencies. I'll just give you an anecdotal example from Senegal, whereby a number of key decision makers within those who work on the macroeconomic forecasting and macroeconomic policies, decisions about fiscal deficit ceilings and so on, have been using the IMF. Senegal has a policy support instrument, which is basically a form of technical assistance without funding. The IMF is not giving any money to Senegalese government, but it is invited to monitor and to say something every 6 months about how things are going, how macroeconomic policy targets are being achieved, and so on. And what happens is that part of the reason this has been agreed is because of strong pressures from within the Ministry of Finance in Senegal, so that the president could be disciplined. Okay, so the president, by the way, is gone. Okay, had a lot of ambitious projects and ideas and so on, and tried always, very often, especially in the last 5 years, to force the Ministry of Finance to bend some of these rules so that they could finance a number of high-profile projects. And these rules were constantly resisted by some of the key decision makers within the ministry, and the IMF was used in order to enforce this resistance. So that's an interesting and quite paradoxical development, which I think is also happening in other, indeed in Mozambique there was also good evidence of this in key areas of decision making within the Ministry of Finance on who was making decisions and why. So that takes us to the question of how the good governance agenda links with these new conditionality frameworks. And indeed, the point is that the good governance agenda has become a central tenet of the new conditionality framework. I'm not going to go into the details because I think Mike is going to talk quite a lot about the rise of the good governance agenda and what this is about. But in a nutshell, there has been, in light of perceived failure of structural adjustment programs, especially in the 1980s, there was an idea that this was partly because of weak institutions or institutional failure. So from these, the key policy messages of getting institutions right arises. Okay, and it gets strengthened from the 1990s onwards, especially with changes within the World Bank in this direction. The aid effectiveness debate, which was quite heated in the late 1990s, associated with the aid fatigue of that period, took this message, this discourse quite seriously as well. And it is indeed from the late 1990s where more sort of empirical evidence in support of the good governance agenda has been tried to, has been disseminated across countries and states. So that raises the question of why, this sort of focus on this. Partly is because of the history of structural adjustment programs and some of the failures, but then we have to make sense of what are the sort of rationales behind that. And you can divide it, I think, in two, but you're going to have more sessions about this. One relates to sort of fiduciary aspect of policy making and the use of resources, of fiscal resources, or the use of aid. So the need for accountability and transparency. So it's not surprising that if there is a sort of common denominator in much of the good governance discourse among aid agencies is this accountability and transparency, which actually may mean also different things to different agencies. But then the other part of the story is related to the alleged positive correlation between good governance and development. A discourse has been fabricated and elaborated about the good governance agenda, the good governance indicators as preconditions for development. And this has been very much pushed, at least in the 2000s, by agencies like the World Bank. And for this you have critical literature that has shown, I think maybe Mike will deal with this, but also Jonathan Dijon in his session, about the spuriousness, the empirical spuriousness of this good governance development link, historically speaking. But that's more or less what, if you hear the discourses, what donors tend to suggest. So this discourse is very much alive, despite the criticisms and some of the questioning that has been emerging in the last 5 years or so about the good governance literature. Indeed, even within the World Bank, there is some serious rethinking of some of these issues. But still, Andrew Mitchell, International Development Secretary in January 2012, say this about the centrality of transparency, good governance, and so on to aid relations. And gave the example of Malawi. They're prepared to punish governments that do not follow the script. So it is very much alive, and it's likely to be alive for the foreseeable future. And that comes the paradox. So Easterly, who doesn't like aid, Bill Easterly, has tried to show that actually all this discourse is pretty much hypocritical. And with some statistical evidence, he shows this graph that, as you can see very clearly, the share of aid to corrupt countries, according to the usual corruption indicators, has actually been increasing, even within the good governance agenda period. So how to make sense of this? That relates to the serious contradictions of the agenda itself. But there are serious implications of the rise of this good governance agenda for aid. And I think one of the most serious implications is the outrageous neglect of the productive sectors in actual expenditures. Okay? A lot of official documents put huge emphasis on the centrality of agriculture for rural poverty reduction and so on. But actually, when you look at the statistics, how much of the fiscal expenditure is going to agricultural sectors, how much aid goes to agriculture, this is what you get. This is OECD aid going to agriculture as a proportion of gross disbursements for Sub-Saharan Africa, going down to less than 2%. That's absolutely ridiculous in the last, 2000, from 2005-6. After the food crisis in 2007-8, there was a slight increase. But if you compare these to the proportion of aid that is going to public administration reform, civil sector reform, governance programs, etc., both bilateral agencies and, more importantly, multilateral agencies, the gap is astonishing. Okay? So a lot of money is actually going to these programs, this sort of soft aid that goes into reforming the public, the state, in a particular direction, a particular ideological direction. And that is also clearly reflected in this figure, which shows total aid from OECD countries, which is the bulk of aid going to Sub-Saharan Africa, how much goes to social and administrative infrastructure, and how little goes to economic infrastructure. And that is a big contrast with the aid complex of the 1950s, 60s, and indeed with many of the success stories of aid giving in the 1950s and 60s, notably South Korea, Taiwan, where economic infrastructure was by far the biggest component of aid allocations. Okay? The World Bank is different precisely because of the comparative advantage of the World Bank in financing large-scale infrastructural projects. But the World Bank has moved hugely towards administrative infrastructure types of aid allocations. So in the past, the World Bank gave around 30% of its loan portfolio in 1979-80 to the agricultural sector. Today, that figure stays around 5 to 6%. Okay? So that takes me to a question of how aid and good governance work in practice and some of the ambiguities and contradictions, and perhaps the paradox that sort of people like Bill Easterly have raised. And part of the problem with the good governance agenda, despite the actual impact that this is having on expenditures, on material resources, is that there is no consensus. Okay? There's no consensus of what good governance means among donors. And that, the implication of that is that what you get is a never-ending list, shopping list of indicators related more or less strongly to governance or to the idea of good governance. Okay? There is a lack of consensus even on the concept of good enough governance. When aid agencies realized that they couldn't agree on a set of 10 indicators, they say, well, can we at least, as good governance, can we at least say that there's something called good enough governance, and then other things may come later, that should be promoted, not even this, okay? Which shows partly, despite this convergence among donors, the elusiveness of the concept itself. The fact that the Danes or the British or the Americans, they have very different understandings of what the key priorities are for governance reforms. So the implication of that, because everyone wants to have, sort of their own pet on the table, is you have a long list of indicators which is constantly expanded as more donors participate in these good governance reforms. A big tension tends to occur, for example, between those who focus mostly on corruption and politics, democracy, elections, and so on, and those aid agencies that focus on the investment climate type of reform, the ones that have a direct impact on how business is conducted, what the World Bank calls the business environment. There may be contradictions between these two in some cases, and these contradictions are simply solved by adding more things. Okay? And what is interesting is that a lot of growth-enhancing capacities, I think Jonathan can speak about this in his session, that characterize some of the most successful stories of development in the last 20, 30, 40 years are missing from this good governance list. So you not only have a very long list of indicators which is very difficult to manage, but actually some key indicators which might improve performance are not there. And if you look at the experiences in East Asia, there's a lot of institutional type of setups and mechanisms which are simply absent from the governance agenda. So it is not surprising that given this lack of cohesion and clarity about what governance means, you have significant contradictions in the way this is actually practiced. Okay, so if one looks at what people call the donor starlets, those countries that are constantly referred by the sort of mainstream aid community as examples to follow. Uganda has been there for a long time. Mozambique indeed has been constantly, referred to as, look at Mozambique, how they did the X, Y, and Z. I'm sure those who work in the administration, they've heard this before. So on and so forth. So some of this in Tanzania, I think to an extent. Actually, if you look at the history, the recent history of this country, the last 15 years, you will find some very significant examples and episodes of serious slippages on fundamental aspects of the good governance agenda. I'm not going to go into the details, but Mozambique is clearly the case where aid agencies have been turning a blind eye on a lot of very serious things that were going on, very much related to the presidency of the country at the time. But that was not a problem, apparently, for some of the donors that were more vocal about the need for governance reforms and so on, and money continued to be pouring towards Mozambique in the last 10 years. So now let me just go towards the end. What's happened during this process is, as I said before, there has been a gradual ideological conversion, which has been very much concentrated in certain areas of decision making, and indeed the ministers of finance have been a key target for a number of aid agencies, notably the World Bank. And what is interesting to note is that there is a growing, sort of intermingling between people working in certain institutions and from the 1990s onwards, and people working at key decision-making positions in many African states. And indeed, if you do life histories of many of the top-level civil servants in a number of countries and their career histories and so on, you will see a lot of overlaps with the IMF and the World Bank. And in fact, that is related, of course, to sort of what happened in the 1980s and 90s, but it's something that has been deepened in the last decade. Interestingly, this is particularly important. It's not only at the level of ministers. You can have very prominent examples, and that's okay. It doesn't necessarily make a massive difference, not always. What makes a massive difference is what happens to those who are sort of at the upper middle level, who are sort of in the day-to-day routine of macroeconomic policy making and so on. And here, indeed, certain agencies, notably the World Bank and the IMF, have been extremely successful at exporting certain technologies for policy making, certain ways of doing policy making, certain sort of manuals, if you want. So whoever works in the Ministry of Finance, what is the proportion of civil servants today in a given Ministry of Finance from a certain level who hasn't been to the usual IMF training program lasting 3 months? Who hasn't been to many of the programs organized by the World Bank Institute since the 1990s onwards? This is clearly the case in many of the countries that at least I know I've been following the last few years. And that has a serious impact, as I say, on how policies are designed and the sorts of thinking that goes behind some of these policies. And what you get as a result of this and the state capacity debuilding effects that I mentioned before is these kind of relationships and this kind of process. On the one hand, an outcome of all this is institutional fragmentation within the state, okay, related to the different pay systems, but also the different ideologies that one can find within the same state, coexisting in a very uneasy way. They move from content to process conditionality, and the extent to which there's the sovereign frontier between recipient states and aid agencies is becoming more and more blurred, more sort of open, with a sort of common participation in decision making is always more significant. And then all the ideology and the technologies of policy processes that come with the so-called capacity building, which has been deepened in the last 20 years or so. All that leads to serious state fragmentation, which has an impact on the capacity to develop or not long-term development strategies. Quite significant institutional entanglement between donors and states, with a very uneasy presence, permanent presence of people from the so-called outsiders are actually pretty much insiders in the policy-making process. The rise of epistemic communities and shared agendas between key factions of the state and the donor community, the aid agencies, shift in material priorities, as I showed before, in allocation of fiscal resources, and in some cases, indeed Mozambique is very much an example, sort of perverse trend towards essentially following the logic of aid maximization. So, as capacities to develop long-term strategies are eroded and the incentives to do so are also eroded, a short-term dynamics of trying to at least maintain or increase your budget tends to rule, okay? That affects not only how the ministries of finance work, but also how sectorial ministries work. So there's a sort of incremental approach towards fiscal expenditure, towards sort of maximizing the amount of aid that goes into the country because of the opportunity cost of declining aid. And of course, there are exceptions to this, okay? And there is a variety of situations, and this is where I would like to end before the conclusions, which is that despite all this gloomy picture that I've painted here, actually agency matters quite a lot. There is still significant scope for domestic agencies as long as there are coalitions and groups and factions within the state that take a different kind of direction. And here the work by Lindsay Whitfield and Alistair Fraser and others in the Global Governance Program in Oxford, or it used to be. There's a book which is called The Politics of Aid and a number of case studies. They come up with this spectrum, qualitative spectrum of the degree of control of states on the policy decisions, so sort of core key policy decisions, institutional changes. Not as ownership in the sense of the literature not ownership, but real control. And here they come up with this qualitative ranking from strongest degree of control to weakest, and this is what they get. countries like Botswana. Botswana is not a very good example for today. They refer to the history of when aid was more significant. But quite interesting, and there are some Ethiopians and Rwandans here. Ethiopia and Rwanda stand out as sort of outliers compared to the usual donor startlets like Mozambique, Tanzania, Mali until recently, and Ghana, in which some of the problems that I've mentioned before have had a much bigger impact here than here and here. So the sort of question is, why not here and here? And then that's when domestic agency and politics, of course, plays a massive role. And that, in a sense, is related to the idea of negotiating capital and what enhances or reduces the negotiating capital of states vis-a-vis aid agencies, supposing that there are different agendas. One can think of geopolitical rents that increase your negotiating capital, that whether you can use it or not, that's a different matter. The sort of Mozambique could have enjoyed a demonstration effect rent, type of rent, in which they could have done lots of things if they had wanted, and aid would not have declined significantly. So the question is, what determines your negotiating capital, and whether you use it or not to expand the degree of control on policy decisions, core policy decisions, and institutional trends. So just to conclude, what are the key, some of the key messages that come out of these debates and these ideas? I think to a large extent, and through various mechanisms, aid has increasingly problematic governance implications, and not of the kind suggested by much of the mainstream development policy consensus. So some of the issues that I mentioned before are not pretty much in the sort of on top of the table. And indeed, there are very few initiatives that have sort of tackled some of these issues head on. The Paris Declaration was supposed to address some of these issues quite seriously. But I mean, if you want, from 2005, there's a number of progress reports that have been published. They're all available on how much progress has been made in individual countries in terms of some of the commitments from donors for the Paris Declaration. And you will see that the picture is actually quite gloomy. And this is done by the donors themselves, especially when it comes to some of the core commitments on alignment to domestic policy processes, harmonization, and so on and so forth, the reduction of transaction costs of the kind that I mentioned before. Very, very little progress. The loss of policy space has been substantial across the board, and I think there are very significant commonalities across countries. But as I suggested in the last slide, it is not complete. The policy space is actually much more varied than some people think, and that relates to important, powerful internal dynamics that affect different countries in different ways. So the importance of context is quite central in these discussions. And then the sort of a final gloomy message is that if anyone wants or expects a serious reform of how aid is delivered and how aid works, do not expect too much from the donor side. Okay? The progress towards the Paris Declaration commitments in the last 5 years clearly show that aid agencies and the aid complex, as a complex, functions with incentive structures that clearly contradict some of the core principles of the Paris Declaration. So it is politically unrealistic to expect that some of these commitments will ever be met. And actually now the momentum has been lost. And it is likely that a lot of the commitments where there has been a bit of progress in the last 5 years, there will be some significant reversals. Notably, for example, the sort of increase in the proportion of aid that goes through budget support. My prediction is that that is likely to decline across the board over the next 5 to 10 years because of domestic politics in donor countries. So let me finish here. I think it was a bit too much. Thanks, and any questions?